The morning sun was shining bright as David pulled his car into the parking lot of First National Bank. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning, and he had just finished his daily jog around the neighborhood. His gray sweatshirt was still damp with sweat, and his sneakers had small bits of dirt from the park trail. At 45 years old, David believed in staying healthy and keeping a regular exercise routine. No matter how busy his schedule got, David looked at his watch and smiled. He had about an hour before his first business meeting of the day. This was the perfect time to handle some personal banking that he had been putting off for weeks. He needed to check on his safety deposit box and review some important financial documents that his accountant had been asking about. As he walked toward the bank entrance, David noticed there were more police cars than usual in the area. He had heard on the local news that there had been a few bank robberies in nearby towns over the past month. The authorities were taking extra safety measures, which made sense. David appreciated that the community was being protected, even though it meant more security checks and longer wait times. Standing near the front entrance was a police officer in full uniform. The officer looked to be in his late 30s, with a serious expression on his face. His badge showed the name Mills, and he had been assigned to patrol this particular bank as part of the increased security measures. Officer Mills had been working in this neighborhood for over 15 years, and he took his job very seriously. David nodded politely at the officer as he approached the glass doors. "Good morning, officer," he said with a friendly smile. Mills looked up from his notepad and gave a brief nod back, but his eyes seemed to study David more carefully than necessary. David didn't think much of it at the time. Police officers were trained to be observant, especially during heightened security situations. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and David stepped into the cool, air-conditioned lobby of First National Bank. The familiar smell of new carpet and fresh coffee greeted him. This bank had been completely renovated 2 years ago, and David still appreciated how modern and welcoming it looked. The marble floors gleamed under the bright lights, and comfortable seating areas were arranged throughout the space. There were about 6 other customers in the bank that morning. An elderly woman was speaking with a teller about her pension deposit. A young couple was sitting in the loan officer's area, probably discussing a mortgage for their first home. A businessman in a suit was using one of the ATM machines near the wall. Everyone seemed to be going about their normal banking business. David walked across the lobby toward the customer service desk. He had been coming to this particular branch for several years now, though he usually called ahead for appointments. Today was different because he had some free time and decided to handle things in person. Sometimes it was better to take care of important matters face-to-face rather than over the phone. The customer service representative was a young man who looked like he had just started working at the bank. His name tag said Kevin, and he seemed nervous about something. When David approached the desk, Kevin looked up with wide eyes. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" Kevin asked, his voice slightly shaky. "I need to access my safety deposit box, and I'd also like to review some of my account information," David replied calmly. "I know I should have made an appointment, but I was hoping someone might have a few minutes to help me out." Kevin looked around the bank nervously, as if he was searching for his supervisor. Let me check with someone about the safety deposit box access. Can I see some identification, please?" David reached into his wallet and pulled out his driver's license and bank card. This was standard procedure, so he didn't mind the request. Kevin took the cards and began typing something into his computer. His fingers seemed to be moving slower than usual, and he kept glancing up at David with an uncertain expression. "Is everything okay?" David asked, noticing that Kevin seemed unusually nervous. "Oh, yes, sir, everything's fine. I'm still learning the system," Kevin replied quickly. "Let me get my supervisor to help you with the safety deposit box." While Kevin went to find his supervisor, David looked around the bank lobby. He noticed that Officer Mills had moved from his position outside and was now standing just inside the entrance doors. The officer seemed to be watching the customers inside the bank, which was probably part of his security duties. David's phone Buzzed with a text message from his assistant reminding him about his 11 a.m. meeting, he quickly replied that he would be there on time, then put his phone back in his pocket. He was looking forward to getting his banking done efficiently so he could grab a quick shower and change into his business clothes. Kevin returned with an older woman who introduced herself as the assistant manager. She had been working at this branch for many years and knew most of the regular customers by name. However, she didn't immediately recognize David, which wasn't unusual since he didn't visit this branch very often. "Good morning, Mr. ." She paused, looking at his identification that Kevin had handed to her. "Mr. Johnson, I understand you'd like to access your safety deposit box today?" "That's right," David confirmed. "I also wanted to review some recent transactions on my accounts. I'm preparing for a meeting with my accountant next week, and I want to make sure all my records are accurate." The assistant manager nodded and began looking through some paperwork. "Of course. Let me pull up your account information and we'll get you taken care of right away. Would you prefer to handle the safety deposit box first, or would you like to review your account statements?" "Let's start with the safety deposit box," David said. "I need to check on some documents that might be important for tax purposes." As they talked, David noticed that Officer Mills had moved closer to where they were standing. The officer appeared to be casually walking around the lobby, but his attention seemed focused on David's conversation with the bank staff. David wondered if this was normal behavior for security purposes, or if there was something specific that had caught the officer's attention. The assistant manager led David toward the secure area where the safety deposit boxes were located. This required passing through a locked door and walking down a hallway lined with small metal boxes. David had been through this process many times before at various banks, so he knew exactly what to expect. "I'll need to verify your signature and check your identification one more time," the assistant manager explained as they walked. "It's just standard security protocol, especially with the increased security measures we have in place right now." David understood completely. With all the recent bank robberies in the area, it made perfect sense that security procedures would be more thorough than usual. He was actually impressed that the bank was taking such careful precautions to protect their customers' valuables and personal information. As they reached the safety deposit box area, David noticed that Officer Mills had followed them and was now standing near the entrance to the secure section. The officer wasn't doing anything wrong, but his presence felt more intense than David had expected. Still, David focused on the task at hand and prepared to access his safety deposit box. Officer Mills watched carefully as David walked through the bank lobby with the assistant manager. Something about this situation didn't feel right to him. In his 15 years of police work, Mills had developed what he called a sixth sense about suspicious behavior. Today, that sense was telling him to pay close attention to this particular customer. Mills had noticed David from the moment he parked his car outside. The man was wearing casual clothes, nothing fancy or expensive looking. His sweatshirt was old and worn, and his sneakers looked like they had seen better days. To Mills, this didn't match the profile of someone who would be conducting serious business at a bank, especially not the kind of business that required access to safety deposit boxes. The officer had dealt with bank robberies before, and he knew that criminals often tried to blend in by dressing down. They would wear ordinary clothes to avoid drawing attention to themselves. They would act calm and friendly to gain the trust of bank employees. Everything about David's behavior seemed to fit this pattern, at least in Mills' mind. Mills pulled out his small notepad and began writing down observations. Subject arrived at 9:42 a.m. in older model sedan. Casual dress, appeared to have been exercising. Immediately requested access to secure areas of bank. He had been trained to document everything when he suspected suspicious activity. From his position near the lobby entrance, Mills could hear parts of the conversation between David and the bank staff. He heard David mention safety deposit boxes and account reviews. This raised another red flag for Mills. In his experience, legitimate customers usually called ahead for appointments when they needed to access safety deposit boxes. The fact that David had just walked in without an appointment seemed suspicious. Mills also noticed that the young employee, Kevin, seemed nervous when talking to David. The officer interpreted this as a sign that even the bank staff sensed something was wrong. What Mills didn't realize was that Kevin was nervous because he was new to his job and worried about making mistakes. Not because he suspected David of anything. The officer decided to move closer so he could observe the interaction more carefully. He walked slowly around the lobby, pretending to check on other customers while keeping David in his sight. Mills prided himself on being thorough and observant. He believed that his careful attention to detail had prevented crimes in the past. As David and the assistant manager moved toward the secure area, Mills made note of this in his pad. Subject gaining access to restricted areas with bank employee. Assistant's behavior consistent with surveillance mission. Mills was beginning to convince himself that David might be casing the bank for a future robbery attempt. The officer thought about the briefings he had received about recent bank robberies in the area. The suspects in those cases had been described as well-dressed and professional-looking, but Mills believed that criminals were smart enough to change their appearance for different jobs. Maybe David was part of a robbery crew that was planning to hit this bank next. Mills decided to call for backup, just in case the situation escalated. He spoke quietly into his radio, requesting that another unit be sent to his location as a precaution. "This is Mills at First National on Maple Street. Requesting backup for possible suspicious activity. No immediate threat, but want extra coverage." The dispatcher confirmed his request and let him know that another officer would be in the area within 10 minutes. Mills felt more confident knowing that help was on the way if he needed it. He continued to watch David through the glass partition that separated the lobby from the safety deposit box area. Inside the secure area, David was completely unaware of the officer's growing suspicions. He was focused on accessing his safety deposit box and retrieving the documents he needed. The assistant manager was being very helpful and professional, explaining each step of the security process as they went through it. "I'll need you to sign." "Here," the assistant manager said, pointing to a signature card. "And then I'll compare it to the signature we have on file for your box." David signed the card without hesitation. His signature was confident and matched the one in the bank's records perfectly. The assistant manager smiled and nodded, satisfied that everything was in order. She had no reason to suspect that David was anything other than a legitimate customer. Mills, however, interpreted David's confident behavior as another sign of suspicious activity. In his mind, David seemed too comfortable with the bank's security procedures. A normal customer might ask questions or seem slightly nervous about all the security checks, but David was handling everything smoothly. To Mills, this suggested that David had experience with bank security systems. The officer made another note: subject familiar with bank security procedures. Signed documents without hesitation. Possible previous surveillance of this location. Mills was building a case in his mind, connecting dots that weren't really there while David was in the safety deposit box area. Mills approached Kevin at the customer service desk. The young employee was organizing some paperwork and still looked nervous about his earlier interaction with David. "Excuse me," Mills said quietly, showing his badge. "I'm Officer Mills. I've been observing that customer you were just helping. Did anything about his behavior seem unusual to you?" Kevin looked confused and a little frightened. He wasn't used to being questioned by police officers about customers. I don't think so, sir. He just wanted to access his safety deposit box." "Why, is something wrong?" "I'm just being cautious," Mills replied. "You seemed nervous when you were talking to him. Did he say or do anything that made you uncomfortable?" Kevin shook his head quickly. "No, sir. I was nervous because I'm new here and I wanted to make sure I followed all the procedures correctly." The customer was very polite and normal. Mills wasn't satisfied with this answer. He believed that Kevin might be too inexperienced to recognize suspicious behavior, or that he might be afraid to admit his concerns. "Did he ask any unusual questions about the bank's security or procedures?" "No, sir," Kevin repeated. "He just wanted normal banking services. He seemed like a regular customer." To me, Mills decided that Kevin either wasn't observant enough to notice the warning signs, or was too inexperienced to understand their significance. The officer made a mental note to include Kevin's nervous behavior in his report, interpreting it as evidence that the bank staff had sensed something wrong about David. Meanwhile, David had successfully accessed his safety deposit box and was reviewing the documents inside. Everything was exactly as he had left it last time. He pulled out several important papers that his accountant had requested and placed them in a folder he had brought with him. The assistant manager waited patiently nearby, occasionally checking her watch. She had other customers to help, but she wanted to make sure David had everything he needed before leaving him alone in the secure area. "Take your time," she said kindly. "I know these financial documents can be confusing. If you need any copies made, I can help you with that at the front desk." David appreciated her patience and professionalism. "Thank you. I think I have everything I need. Just give me another minute to double-check these papers." Outside in the lobby, Mills was growing more impatient. David had been in the secure area for about 20 minutes now, which seemed like a long time to the officer. Mills was beginning to wonder if David was taking photographs of the security setup or memorizing details about the bank's layout. The backup officer that Mills had requested arrived and entered the bank quietly. Officer Rodriguez was younger than Mills and had less experience, but he respected Mills' judgment and was ready to assist if needed. "What's the situation?" Rodriguez asked quietly. Mills pointed toward the secure area where David was still working. "Suspicious customer in the safety deposit box area. Something doesn't feel right about this guy. I want to question him when he comes out." Rodriguez nodded and positioned himself on the other side of the lobby so they could observe David from different angles when he emerged from the secure area. Both officers were now focused on David, convinced that they were preventing a potential crime. David finished organizing his documents and closed his safety deposit box. He thanked the assistant manager for her help and followed her back toward the main lobby. As they walked, David was thinking about his upcoming meeting and feeling satisfied that he had taken care of this important banking business. David walked back into the main lobby of the bank feeling satisfied with his visit. He had successfully retrieved all the documents his accountant needed, and everything had gone smoothly. The assistant manager had been helpful and professional throughout the entire process. Now he could head home, shower, and get ready for his important business meeting. As David approached the customer service desk to thank Kevin for his earlier assistance, he noticed that there were now 2 police officers in the bank lobby. This seemed like more security than before, but David assumed it was just part of the enhanced safety measures he had heard about on the news. Officer Mills had been watching the entrance to the secure area, waiting for David to emerge. When David finally appeared, Mills felt his suspicions were confirmed. The man had spent what seemed like an unusually long time in the safety deposit box area. In Mills' mind, this was exactly the kind of behavior he would expect from someone who was gathering information for a future crime. Mills exchanged a quick glance with Officer Rodriguez, who gave a small nod indicating he was ready to assist. Both officers had positioned themselves strategically around the lobby so they could approach David from different directions if necessary. David was walking toward the exit doors when Officer Mills stepped into his path. The officer's hand rested casually on his belt near his radio and other equipment. His stance was confident and authoritative, the way he had been trained to position himself when approaching potentially dangerous subjects. "Excuse me, sir," Mills said in a firm voice that carried across the quiet lobby. "I'd like to have a word with you." David stopped walking and looked at the officer with mild surprise. "Of course, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" Several other customers in the bank turned their heads to see what was happening. The elderly woman who had been discussing her pension deposit looked concerned. The young couple in the loan area stopped their conversation and stared. Even Kevin at the customer service desk was watching nervously. Mills pulled out his notepad and flipped it open. "I've been observing your activities here in the bank this morning, and I have some questions about your business here." David remained calm, though he was beginning to feel confused about why a police officer would be questioning him. "I'm not sure I understand, officer. I was just conducting some personal banking business. Is there a problem?" "That's what I'm trying to determine," Mills replied, his tone becoming more serious. "You spent a considerable amount of time in the secure area of this bank. Can you explain what you were doing back there?" David looked around the lobby and noticed that everyone was now watching their conversation. He felt a bit embarrassed to be questioned so publicly, but he wanted to cooperate with law enforcement. "I was accessing my safety deposit box to retrieve some financial documents. The assistant manager can confirm that." Mills wrote something in his notepad. "I see, and you didn't call ahead to make an appointment for this visit?" "No, I didn't," David admitted. "I had some free time this morning after my jog, so I decided to take care of this business while I was in the area. Is that against bank policy?" Officer Rodriguez had moved closer during this conversation, positioning himself where he could easily step in if needed. His presence added to the tension that was building in the lobby. Other customers were starting to whisper among themselves. Wondering what was happening, Mills continued his questioning. "What kind of documents were you retrieving from your safety deposit box?" David was starting to feel frustrated by the line of questioning, but he tried to remain patient. "They were personal financial records that my accountant requested for tax preparation." "I don't understand why this is a police matter. I'm just doing my job, sir," Mills responded firmly. "There have been several bank robberies in this area recently, and we're taking extra precautions to ensure everyone's safety." David nodded, understanding the need for security. "I appreciate that, officer. I want the community to be safe too. But I'm just a regular customer conducting normal banking business." Mills wasn't satisfied with David's answers. In his experience, criminals often had reasonable explanations for their behavior. The fact that David seemed so calm and prepared with his responses actually made Mills more suspicious, not less. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Mills said. Extending his hand, David reached into his wallet and pulled out his driver's license, the same one he had already shown to the bank employees. "Here you go, officer." Mills examined the license carefully, checking the photo against David's face and noting the address and other details. Everything appeared to be legitimate, but Mills had seen fake identification before. He handed the license to Officer Rodriguez for a second. "Opinion, Mr. Johnson," Mills said, reading from the license. "Can you tell me where you live?" David recited his address exactly as it appeared on his driver's license. He also provided his phone number and other identifying information when asked. Every answer he gave was accurate and consistent. The assistant manager who had helped David earlier was watching this interaction with growing concern. She approached the group carefully, not wanting to interfere with police business, but feeling that she should speak up for her customer. "Excuse me, officers," she said politely. "Is there some kind of problem?" "Mr. Johnson is a legitimate customer. I personally assisted him with his safety deposit box access this morning." Mills turned to look at the assistant manager. "Ma'am, I appreciate your input, but we're conducting a security investigation. Can you confirm that this customer followed all proper procedures?" "Yes, absolutely," she replied without hesitation. "He provided proper identification, his signature matched our records, and he accessed only his own safety deposit box. Everything was completely normal and by the book." Mills made note of her statement but wasn't entirely convinced. He had seen cases where bank employees were intimidated or fooled by sophisticated criminals. "How often does this customer typically visit your bank?" The assistant manager paused, thinking about the question. "I don't see him very frequently, but that's not unusual. Many of our safety deposit box customers only visit a few times a year." This answer actually increased Mill's suspicions rather than reducing them. In his mind, infrequent visits could indicate that David was not a regular, legitimate customer, but someone who was using the bank for suspicious purposes. David was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Officer, I've answered all your questions and provided my identification. I've cooperated fully with your investigation. Am I free to leave now? I have a business meeting I need to get to. Mills looked at Officer Rodriguez, who shrugged slightly. They didn't have any concrete evidence of wrongdoing, but Mills' instincts were still telling him that something wasn't right about this situation. Mr. Johnson, Mills said slowly, I'm going to need you to remain here while I verify some information. This shouldn't take long. David felt his patience starting to wear thin. What information do you need to verify? I've shown you my identification, and the bank staff has confirmed that I'm a legitimate customer. I want to run a background check and confirm that you are who you say you are, Mills explained. With the increased security situation, we can't be too careful. Other customers in the bank were becoming more interested in the conversation. Some were pulling out their phones, though they weren't actively recording yet. The situation was creating a disturbance that was affecting everyone in the building. David looked at his watch and realized that this delay was going to make him late for his meeting. Officer, I understand your need for security, but this seems excessive. I haven't done anything wrong, and I have important business to attend to. Mills interpreted David's impatience as another sign of suspicious behavior. In his experience, innocent people were usually more willing to cooperate with police investigations, even when they were inconvenienced. The tension in the bank lobby was growing thicker by the minute. David stood facing Officer Mills, trying to understand why a simple banking visit had turned into a police investigation. Other customers were no longer pretending to mind their own business. Everyone was watching the confrontation unfold, and several people had their phones ready to record if things got worse. Officer Mills had spent the last few minutes talking quietly into his radio, running David's identification through the police database. While they waited for the results, Officer Rodriguez kept a close eye on David, as if he might try to run at any moment. The whole situation felt surreal to David, who had never been in trouble with the law in his entire life. Mr. Johnson, Mills said, putting his radio back on his belt, I'm going to need you to step over here against the wall while we sort this out. David felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean, step against the wall? Am I being arrested? What are the charges? You're not under arrest at this time, Mills replied, but I need to ensure everyone's safety while we complete our investigation. Please move to the wall and place your hands where I can see them. David looked around the lobby desperately, hoping someone would speak up for him. The assistant manager who had helped him earlier looked upset but seemed afraid to challenge the police officers. Kevin, the young customer service representative, was watching with wide eyes, clearly out of his depth in this situation. Officer, this is ridiculous, David said, his voice remaining calm despite his growing frustration. I have done absolutely nothing wrong. I came here to access my own safety deposit box, which I did with proper identification and following all bank procedures. I don't understand why I'm being treated like a criminal. Mills was unmoved by David's protests. Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. Please move to the wall and place your hands in a visible position. David realized he had no choice but to comply. Fighting with police officers would only make the situation worse, regardless of how wrong they were. He walked slowly to the wall that Mills had indicated, feeling the eyes of every person in the bank following his movement. This is completely unnecessary, David said as he placed his hands against the wall. I am a law-abiding citizen, and I have rights. You do have rights, Mills agreed, and one of those rights is to remain silent. I suggest you use it. Officer Rodriguez moved to assist Mills as they began what appeared to be a search procedure. David couldn't believe this was happening to him. He thought about his upcoming business meeting and wondered how he was going to explain being late. Because he was detained by police at a bank, the elderly woman who had been conducting banking business earlier approached the customer service desk where Kevin was standing. Young man, she said quietly, this doesn't seem right. That gentleman was very polite and normal. Why are the police treating him this way? Kevin didn't know how to answer. He was new to his job and had never seen anything like this before. I don't know, ma'am. Maybe there's something we don't understand about the situation. Meanwhile, the young couple who had been discussing a mortgage loan were whispering to each other. The woman was holding her phone, recording video of what was happening. "This looks like harassment to me," she said quietly to her husband. "That man hasn't done anything aggressive or threatening." Officer Mills was patting down David's clothing, checking for weapons or other suspicious items. He found David's wallet, keys, and phone, but nothing that indicated criminal activity. The documents that David had retrieved from his safety deposit box were in a neat folder, clearly organized and professional-looking. "What are these documents?" Mills asked, flipping through the folder. "I told you already," David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "They're financial records for my accountant. Tax documents, investment statements, that sort of thing." Mills examined the papers more closely. They appeared to be legitimate financial documents with David's name on them. There were bank statements, investment portfolio summaries, and several legal documents related to business transactions. Everything looked professional and official. "These documents show significant financial activity," Mills observed. "How do you explain having access to this level of financial resources?" David was stunned by the question. "How do I explain it?" "I explain it by saying that I've worked hard my entire life and been successful in business." "Is it illegal to have money in America?" Officer Rodriguez looked at some of the documents over Mills' shoulder. Even he was beginning to wonder if they might be making a mistake. The paperwork looked legitimate, and the amounts involved suggested that David was a wealthy individual, not a common criminal. Mills, however, was becoming more convinced that something was wrong. In his experience, the most dangerous criminals were often the ones who appeared most legitimate on the surface. The fact that David had expensive lawyers and sophisticated financial arrangements only made Mills more suspicious. "Mr. Johnson," Mills said, "I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back." David's heart started racing. "Are you arresting me?" "On what charges?" "I'm detaining you for questioning regarding suspicious activity," Mills replied, pulling out his handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "This is insane!" David exclaimed. But he didn't resist as Mills placed the handcuffs on his wrists. "I demand to speak to my lawyer immediately." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut seemed to echo through the quiet bank lobby. Several customers gasped audibly, and the woman with the phone made sure she was recording everything clearly. The assistant manager finally found her courage and approached the officers. "Excuse me," she said firmly, "but I really think there's been a misunderstanding here. This customer has done nothing wrong. He followed all our procedures perfectly." Mills turned to face her. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is now a police matter. Please step back and allow us to do our job." "But I know this customer," she insisted. "He's been banking with us for years. There's no way he's involved in any criminal activity." Mills wasn't interested in her opinion. "How well do you really know your customers? Do you know what they do when they're not in your bank?" David stood against the wall with his hands cuffed behind his back, trying to process what was happening to him. He thought about calling his lawyer, but his phone was now in Officer Mills' possession. He thought about his business meeting and how his colleagues would react when he didn't show up. "Officer," David said, turning his head to look at Mills, "you're making a serious mistake here. When this is all sorted out, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do." Mills wasn't concerned about David's threats. "We'll see about that, Mr. Johnson. Right now, you're the one who needs to do some explaining." The bank manager, who had been in a meeting in her office, finally emerged to see what was causing the commotion in her lobby. When she saw David in handcuffs, her face went pale. She hurried toward the group, but Officer Rodriguez stepped forward to block her path. "Ma'am, please stay back. This is a police investigation." "I'm the bank manager," she said, showing her identification badge. "I need to understand what's happening in my bank." Mills looked at her briefly. "We're investigating suspicious activity involving one of your customers. Everything is under control?" The bank manager looked at David, and something about his face seemed familiar to her. She couldn't quite place where she had seen him before. But she had a nagging feeling that she should know who he was. More customers were entering the bank for their morning banking, only to find a tense situation in progress. Some turned around and left immediately, while others stayed to watch what was happening. The normal, peaceful atmosphere of the bank had been completely disrupted. David closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to stay calm despite the humiliating situation he found himself in. He knew that eventually this misunderstanding would be resolved, but he also knew that the damage to his dignity and reputation might be lasting. The bank manager, Patricia Chun, stood frozen in place as she stared at David's face. Something was definitely familiar about him, but with the stress of the situation and seeing him in handcuffs, she couldn't immediately place where she knew him from. Her mind was racing through possibilities, trying to connect the dots. Patricia had been working at First National Bank for over 12 years, starting as a teller and working her way up to branch manager. She prided herself on knowing the bank's most important customers, especially those who conducted significant business with them. As she looked at David more carefully, a feeling of recognition was growing stronger. "Officer Mills," Patricia said, stepping closer despite Rodriguez's attempt to keep her back, "I really need to speak with you about this situation. As the manager of this bank, I have a responsibility to protect our customers from any misunderstandings." Mills looked annoyed by her persistence. "Ma'am, I've already explained that this is a police matter. Your customer is being detained for suspicious activity. The best thing you can do is stay out of the way and let us handle this." Patricia wasn't satisfied with that answer. She had spent too many years in customer service to simply stand by while one of her customers was being mistreated. What exactly was suspicious about his activity? "I can review our security footage and verify everything he did while he was here. He spent an unusual amount of time in the safety deposit box area," Mills explained impatiently. "He didn't have an appointment, and he was asking detailed questions about bank procedures. That fits the profile of someone who might be planning a robbery." Patricia looked incredulous. "Accessing a safety deposit box is not suspicious activity. It's exactly what safety deposit boxes are for. And we don't require appointments for safety deposit box acts during normal business hours." David, still standing against the wall in handcuffs, was listening to this conversation with growing hope that the bank manager might be able to help resolve this ridiculous situation. "Thank you," he said to Patricia. "Finally, someone with common sense." Mills shot David a warning look. "I told you to remain silent." Patricia was studying David's face more intently now. There was something about his features, his voice, and his general demeanor that was triggering a memory. She had definitely seen him before, but not as a regular customer conducting routine banking business. "What did you say your name was?" Patricia asked David directly. "David Johnson," he replied, grateful that someone was finally treating him like a human being instead of a criminal. Patricia repeated the name quietly to herself. "David Johnson. David Johnson ... Suddenly, her eyes went wide as the pieces clicked into place. "Oh my God," she whispered. Officer Mills noticed the change in her expression immediately. "What is it? Do you recognize this man from somewhere?" Patricia's hands were starting to shake slightly. She looked from David to the officers and back to David again. "Officers, I think there's been a terrible mistake here." "What kind of mistake?" Rodriguez asked, moving closer to hear her explanation. Patricia took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "This man, Mr. Johnson, he's not just a regular customer of our bank." Mills felt a surge of vindication. "I knew it. What's his real story? Is he wanted for something?" No, you don't understand," Patricia said quickly. "He's not wanted for anything. He's—" She paused, looking at David with a mixture of recognition and horror at what was happening to him. "He's one of our major stakeholders." Mills looked confused. "What does that mean exactly?" Patricia's voice was getting stronger as her memory became clearer. "It means he owns a significant portion of this bank. Mr. Johnson is not just a customer here. He's one of the people who helped finance this entire branch." David closed his eyes in relief. Finally, someone remembered who he was. He had been trying to stay low-key about his business relationships, but in this situation, He was grateful that his identity was being revealed. Officer Rodriguez looked skeptical. How can you be sure about that? Maybe you're thinking of someone else. Patricia shook her head firmly. No, I'm certain. I was at the grand opening ceremony when this branch was renovated. 2 years ago, Mr. Johnson was one of the VIP guests who spoke at the event. He's been a major investor in our bank for several years. Mills wasn't ready to accept this explanation. That's impossible. Look at how he's dressed. He's wearing old clothes and sneakers. That's not how a bank owner would dress. Officer, Patricia said with growing confidence, wealthy people don't always dress the way you might expect them to. Mr. Johnson told us he had been jogging this morning. It makes perfect sense that he would be in exercise clothes. The assistant manager, who had helped David earlier, was listening to this conversation with amazement. She approached the group carefully. Patricia, are you saying that Mr. Johnson is the Mr. Johnson? The one from the board meetings? Patricia nodded emphatically. That's exactly what I'm saying. He attends our quarterly investor meetings. He's been a major supporter of our community banking initiatives. David finally spoke up. I tried to keep a low profile during my visit today. I don't usually announce my business relationships when I'm just conducting routine personal banking. Mills was beginning to feel the first stirrings of doubt about his actions. If what you're saying is true, then why didn't he mention this earlier when I was questioning him? Because I shouldn't have to, David replied with dignity. Every customer in this bank deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their financial status. I shouldn't need to prove my wealth to avoid being handcuffed and humiliated. Patricia was now fully convinced of David's identity, and she was becoming increasingly upset about how he had been treated. Officers, I can provide documentation. To prove everything I'm telling you, Mr. Johnson's investment in our bank is a matter of public record. Several other bank employees had gathered around during this conversation. An older teller named Robert, who had been working at the bank for over 20 years, also recognized David now that Patricia had identified him. Oh, yes, Robert said. I remember Mr. Johnson from the renovation ceremony. He gave a speech about supporting local businesses and community development. He was very gracious and friendly to all the staff. Mills was starting to realize that he might have made a serious error in judgment. If this man is really who you say he is, then why doesn't he carry identification showing his business relationship with the bank? Patricia looked exasperated. Officer, bank ownership is not something people typically carry around on a card in their wallet. It's documented in corporate filings and legal agreements. David added, my relationship with this bank is handled through my business managers and lawyers. I don't need special identification to access my personal safety deposit box or conduct routine banking. The young woman who had been recording the incident on her phone was still filming. She had captured the entire conversation, including Patricia's identification of David as a major bank stakeholder. The video was already being shared on social media, where people were commenting about the obvious case of profiling that had occurred. Officer Rodriguez was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Mills, he said quietly, maybe we should reconsider what we're doing here. Mills was stubborn and didn't want to admit that he had made a mistake. Even if this man is wealthy, that doesn't automatically mean he's innocent of suspicious behavior. Patricia's patience was finally exhausted. Officer Mills, with all due respect, there was nothing suspicious about Mr. Johnson's behavior. He conducted normal banking business in a normal way. The only thing suspicious here is how you've treated one of our most valued customers. Other customers in the bank were now openly expressing their disapproval of the situation. The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier was shaking her head in disgust. This is shameful, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. That poor man has done nothing wrong. David remained calm despite his humiliating position. Officers, I understand that you were trying to do your job and protect the community, but I hope you can see now that your suspicions were unfounded. May I please have these handcuffs removed? Officer Mills stood in the middle of the bank lobby, feeling the weight of everyone's stares. The confident authority he had displayed just minutes earlier was beginning to crumble as the reality of the situation became clearer. Patricia Chun, the bank manager, was not backing down from her identification of David, and other employees were confirming her story. "I want to see proof," Mills said stubbornly, though his voice lacked the certainty it had before. "Anyone can claim to know." I need documentation before I remove these handcuffs." Patricia nodded quickly. "Of course. I can pull up our investor records right now." She hurried to the nearest computer terminal and began typing rapidly. "Mr. Johnson's investment information is in our corporate database." David remained patient despite the humiliating position he was in. Standing against the wall in handcuffs while bank employees searched for proof of his identity was not how he had planned to spend his morning. But he understood that the truth needed to come out completely. "Officer," David said calmly, "I also have business cards in my wallet that you took from me. Those will show my company information and contact details for my office." Mills reluctantly pulled David's wallet from his pocket and opened it. Inside, along with David's driver's license and credit cards, were several business cards. The cards were elegant and professional, showing David as the president and CEO of Johnson Holdings, a major investment company. Officer Rodriguez looked at the business cards over Mills' shoulder. "These look legitimate," he said quietly, "and expensive. Not the kind of thing someone would fake just to impress people at a bank." Patricia called out from the computer terminal, "I found his records. Mr. David Johnson, president of Johnson Holdings, owns approximately 15% of First National Bank's total shares. He's been an investor with us for over 8 years. A murmur went through the crowd of customers and employees who were watching the scene unfold. 15% ownership was a significant stake in any bank. David wasn't just a wealthy customer. He was essentially one of the bank's owners. Mills felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. 15% ownership meant that David Johnson was probably one of the most important people who could possibly walk into this bank. And Mills had treated him like a common criminal based on nothing more than assumptions and prejudices. "Show me the screen," Mills demanded. Walking over to Patricia's computer terminal, Patricia turned the monitor so Mills could see it clearly. The official bank records showed David's full name, his company information, the date he became an investor, and the current value of his holdings. Everything confirmed exactly what Patricia had been saying. David's investment in the bank was worth several $1,000,000, making him one of their most valuable business partners. The records also showed that he regularly attended board meetings and had been instrumental in several major decisions about the bank's expansion and community programs. Officer Rodriguez was now looking very uncomfortable. "Mills," he said quietly, "I think we need to end this situation right now." But Mills was still resistant to admitting his mistake. "Investment records can be forged," he said weakly. "I've seen sophisticated fraud operations before." Patricia had reached the end of her patience with Officer Mills' stubbornness. "Officer, if you believe our official bank records are forged, then you're essentially accusing our entire institution of being part of a criminal conspiracy. Is that really what you want to claim?" Robert, the senior teller, approached the group, carrying a framed photograph. "Officer Mills, maybe this will convince you." He held up the picture, which showed David speaking at a podium during the bank's renovation ceremony 2 years earlier. David was wearing a suit in the photo and looked exactly like he did now, just dressed more formally. "This photo was taken at our grand reopening event," Robert explained. "Mr. Johnson gave a speech about the importance of community banking and local investment. The picture has been hanging in our break room ever since." Mills looked at the photograph and felt his last arguments crumbling away. The man in the picture was definitely the same person he had in handcuffs. David's face was unmistakable, and the formal setting of the photo confirmed his important relationship with the bank. The assistant manager who had originally helped David spoke up as well. "Officer, I should have recognized Mr. Johnson immediately when he came in this morning. I apologize for not speaking up sooner. He's always been very kind to our staff." David finally decided to help resolve the situation by providing additional information. Officer Mills, if you call my office, my assistant can confirm my identity and provide references. The number is on my business card. You can also contact the bank's main headquarters and they will verify my investor status. Mills was running out of reasonable objections. Every piece of evidence was pointing to the same conclusion. He had made a terrible mistake. David Johnson was not a suspicious character planning to rob the bank. He was actually one of the bank's owners. Patricia printed out a copy of David's investor records from her computer. Here's an official printout of Mr. Johnson's holdings with our bank. This document shows the date he became an investor, the amount of his investment, and his current ownership percentage. Mills took the printout and studied it carefully. The document looked completely official and legitimate. It had the bank's letterhead, official seals, and detailed financial information that would be impossible to forge convincingly. Officer Rodriguez had seen enough evidence. Mills, we need to remove those handcuffs right now. This has gone far enough. Mills finally realized that he had no choice but to accept the truth. Mr. Johnson, he said reluctantly, I'm going to remove your handcuffs now. David felt immense relief as the metal restraints were finally taken off his wrists. He rubbed his hands together to restore circulation and straightened his clothing. The humiliation of being handcuffed in public was something he would not forget easily. Thank you, David said simply. Maintaining his dignity despite everything that had happened, Patricia immediately approached David with deep concern. Mr. Johnson, I am so sorry about what you've experienced here today. This is absolutely not how we treat our valued customers and investors. David nodded graciously. I understand that this was a misunderstanding, Patricia. I appreciate you and your staff speaking up to resolve the situation. The other customers in the bank were now openly expressing their outrage about what they had witnessed. The elderly woman who had been watching the entire incident approached David directly. Sir, I saw everything that happened here, and it was completely wrong, she said firmly. That officer had no right to treat you that way. I hope you take action about this. The young woman who had been recording the incident on her phone spoke up as well. I got everything on video. The whole thing was recorded. This needs to be shared so people can see what really happened. Mills was beginning to understand the full scope of his error. He had not only mistreated an innocent person, but he had done it to someone who was a prominent member of the business community. The potential consequences for his career were starting to become clear. Mr. Johnson, Mills said awkwardly, I was just trying to do my job and protect the community from potential threats. David looked at Mills with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. Officer, I respect the need for security and law enforcement, but what happened here today was not about security. It was about assumptions and prejudice. The atmosphere in the bank lobby had completely changed from what it was an hour earlier. What had started as a quiet Tuesday morning of routine banking had turned into a dramatic confrontation that would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. David stood rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had been, while Officer Mills tried to process the magnitude of his mistake. Patricia Chun, the bank manager, was already thinking about the damage control that would be needed. She knew that word of this incident would spread quickly through the business community, and the bank's reputation could be seriously affected if they didn't handle the aftermath properly. Mr. Johnson, Patricia said respectfully, I want to personally apologize on behalf of First National Bank. What happened to you today is completely unacceptable, and we will be reviewing our security procedures to ensure this never happens. Again, David appreciated her concern, but he was also thinking about the bigger picture. Patricia, this incident isn't really about bank security procedures. The bank employees behaved professionally throughout this entire situation. The problem was with assumptions that were made based on my appearance. Officer Rodriguez was feeling increasingly uncomfortable about his role in the incident. He had followed Mills' lead without questioning whether their actions were justified. Now he was realizing that he shared responsibility for what had happened. Mr. Johnson, Rodriguez said quietly, I want to apologize for my part in this. I should have asked more questions before going along with the detention. David nodded acknowledgement of the apology, but his attention was focused on Officer Mills, who seemed to be struggling with accepting the reality of his error. Mills was still holding David's identification and the business cards as if examining them might somehow change what had happened. The young woman who had recorded the incident on her phone approached David carefully. "Sir, I have video of everything that happened here. I think people need to see this. Would you be okay with me sharing this video?" David considered the question thoughtfully. He wasn't someone who normally sought public attention, preferring to handle his business matters privately. But he also understood that this incident represented a much larger problem that affected many people beyond himself. "I think people should see what happened," David said finally. "But I would appreciate it if you could blur out any personal information like my address or phone number if those appear in the video." The woman nodded eagerly. "Of course, I'll be very careful about privacy. But people need to see how you were treated for just walking into a bank." Other customers who had witnessed the incident were also taking action. The elderly woman had been taking notes on a piece of paper, documenting everything she had seen. The young couple had been discussing whether they should report the incident to someone in authority. "This is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be reported," the young husband said to his wife. That police officer was completely out of line. Officer Mills finally spoke up, though his voice lacked the confidence it had shown earlier. "Mr. Johnson, I want you to know that my actions were based on legitimate security concerns. We've had several bank robberies in this area recently." David looked at Mills directly. "Officer, I understand that bank robberies are a real concern. But tell me honestly, what specifically did I do that was suspicious?" "I walked into a bank during normal business hours, showed proper identification, and accessed my own safety deposit box following all required procedures." Mills struggled to answer the question. When he tried to list the behaviors that had seemed suspicious to him, they all sounded trivial and unreasonable when spoken out loud. "You were dressed casually," Mills said weakly. "I had been jogging," David replied calmly. "You didn't have an appointment," Mills continued. "Appointments aren't required for safety deposit box access," David pointed out. "You spent a long time in the secure area," Mills added. "I was organizing important financial documents," David explained. "That takes time to do properly." Each of Mills' explanations sounded more unreasonable than the last. The truth was becoming clear to everyone in the room. David had been targeted not because of anything he had done, but because of how he looked. And what assumptions Mills had made about him. Patricia was documenting everything that was being said, knowing that she would need to write a detailed report about the incident for the bank's corporate headquarters. She was also thinking about what steps the bank could take to support David and make amends for what had happened. "Mr. Johnson," Patricia said, "I want to assure you that we will be reporting this incident to the appropriate authorities. The bank does not tolerate discrimination of any kind, and we will be working with local police leadership to address this situation." David appreciated her commitment, but he was also realistic about what kind of changes might actually result from reporting the incident. "Patricia, I hope that something positive can come from this experience. But I'm not particularly optimistic about police departments investigating themselves." Robert, the senior teller, had been listening to the conversation while helping other customers who were still trying to conduct their banking business. He approached the group during a break in the discussion. "Mr. Johnson," Robert said, "I've been working in banks for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened to you today. I want you to know that you have my full support. If you decide to take legal action." Several other bank employees nodded in agreement. They had all been disturbed by watching a valued customer and investor being treated so poorly, especially when he had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Officer Mills was beginning to understand that this incident could have serious consequences for his career. Handcuffing an innocent person was bad enough, but doing it to a prominent business leader who owned part of the bank made the situation much worse. "Mr. Johnson," Mills said desperately, "I hope we can resolve this matter without it becoming a bigger issue. I was just trying to do my job." David looked at Mills with a mixture of disappointment and sadness. Officer, the biggest issue here is not what happens to you or to me. The biggest issue is how many other people are treated the way you treated me, people who don't have the resources or connections to fight back. The truth of David's statement hung in the air. Everyone in the room understood that if David had been a regular customer without wealth or influence, this incident might have ended very differently. He might have been arrested, charged with false crimes, or worse. Patricia was already planning the steps she would take to address the situation. Mr. Johnson, I would like to schedule a meeting with you and our corporate leadership to discuss how we can prevent incidents like this from happening in the future. David nodded. I think that would be valuable, Patricia. But I also think we need to have broader conversations in this community about training, accountability, and how we treat people based on assumptions about their appearance. The young woman with the phone spoke up again. Mr. Johnson, this video is already getting a lot of attention online. People are really upset about what they're seeing. David wasn't surprised. In the age of social media, incidents like this could spread quickly and generate widespread discussion. He hoped that the attention might lead to meaningful changes, not just temporary outrage. I hope people use this as an opportunity to examine their own assumptions and prejudices, David said. This kind of thing happens every day to people who don't have cameras recording them. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at First National Bank, and the story had taken on a life of its own. The video recorded by the young woman had been viewed millions of times across various social media platforms. News outlets had picked up the story, and it had sparked conversations about policing, prejudice, and accountability in communities across the country. David sat in his office, looking out the window at the city below. His phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests from journalists, invitations to speak at conferences, and calls from civil rights organizations wanting his support for various causes. He had been selective about which opportunities to pursue, focusing on those that might lead to real change rather than just temporary attention. The bank had moved quickly to address the situation. Patricia Chun had worked with corporate headquarters to implement new training programs for security staff and to establish better protocols for handling police interactions on bank property. They had also issued a public apology and made a significant donation to local civil rights organizations. Officer Mills had been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation by the police department's Internal Affairs Division. The investigation had expanded beyond just the bank incident to examine Mills' entire record, including previous complaints about his conduct. Several other cases had come to light where Mills had been accused of using excessive force or showing bias in his interactions with community members. David had decided to work with a civil rights attorney to pursue legal action, not primarily for financial compensation, but to ensure that the incident would have meaningful consequences. The lawsuit had been filed against both Officer Mills personally and the police department, alleging violations of civil rights and demanding changes to training and oversight procedures. The young woman who had recorded the video, Jessica, had become an unexpected advocate for police reform. She had started a social media campaign encouraging people to record and report incidents of police misconduct. Her video of David's treatment had given her a platform to speak about broader issues of justice and accountability. Patricia Chun had kept her promise to David about implementing changes at the bank. She had worked with diversity consultants to review all of the bank's policies and procedures, ensuring that customers would be treated fairly regardless of their appearance or background. The bank had also hired a community liaison officer to strengthen relationships with local organizations. David had used his business influence to push for changes beyond just the banking industry. He had worked with other business leaders to establish a fund that would provide legal support for people who experienced discrimination but couldn't afford to fight back. The fund had already helped several families pursue cases that might otherwise have been ignored. Officer Rodriguez had voluntarily enrolled in additional training programs and had become an advocate within the police department for better community relations. He had spoken publicly about his role in David's treatment and his commitment to ensuring that similar incidents didn't happen again, the police chief had announced new policies, requiring officers to document their reasons for detaining citizens and to get supervisor approval before using handcuffs on people who were not under arrest. The department had also implemented mandatory bias training for all officers and established a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints. David had received hundreds of letters and emails from people sharing their own stories of discrimination and unfair treatment by police. Many of these stories were from people who didn't have the resources or platform to fight back effectively. Reading these accounts had strengthened David's resolve to use his experience as a catalyst for broader change. The incident had also prompted conversations within the business community about responsibility and privilege. David had spoken at several conferences about the importance of successful people using their influence to address systemic problems rather than simply protecting their own interests. Jessica's video continued to be shared and discussed, often accompanied by other examples of police misconduct and discrimination. The hashtag associated with the incident had been used millions of times, and it had become part of a larger movement demanding accountability and reform. David had also worked with local schools to develop educational programs about civil rights and equal treatment. He believed that lasting change would require teaching young people to recognize and challenge their own prejudices and assumptions. The bank had seen an increase in business from customers who appreciated their response to the incident. Many people had opened accounts specifically to support an institution that had taken meaningful action to address discrimination. Rather than just offering empty apologies, Officer Mills had eventually resigned from the police force rather than face the continuing investigation and likely termination. He had issued a public apology, though many people felt it was too little and too late. The incident had effectively ended his career in law enforcement. David reflected on how a simple banking visit had changed so many lives, including his own. He had always been successful in business, but the incident had given him a new sense of purpose and responsibility. He understood that his wealth and influence came with an obligation to fight for people who didn't have the same advantages. The legal case was still proceeding through the courts, but David was confident that it would result in meaningful changes to police policies and training. More importantly, the publicity around the case had inspired other communities to examine their own law enforcement practices and implement reforms. Patricia had been promoted to a regional management position, partly in recognition of her handling of the incident and her work to implement changes. She continued to work closely with David on community initiatives and had become a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion in the banking industry. David had established a scholarship fund for young people from underrepresented communities who wanted to pursue careers in business or law. He hoped that increasing diversity in positions of influence would help prevent future incidents like the one he had experienced. The story had international attention as well, with news outlets in other countries using it as an example of ongoing challenges with policing and racial justice in America. David had been invited to speak at conferences around the world about using business success to drive social change. As David prepared for another meeting with community leaders about police reform, he thought about the letter he had received that morning from a young man who had been inspired by the story to pursue a career in civil rights law. These personal connections reminded David that individual actions could have far-reaching effects. The incident at First National Bank had been humiliating and frustrating, but it had also created opportunities for positive change that might not have existed otherwise. David was determined to continue using his experience and influence to ensure that other people wouldn't have to endure what he had gone through, and that when such incidents did occur, there would be real consequences and meaningful reforms. Looking ahead, David knew that the work of creating lasting change would take years, not weeks or months. But he was committed to staying involved and using his resources to support organizations and individuals who were fighting for justice and equality. The incident had taught him that privilege comes with responsibility, and he was determined to live up to that responsibility for the rest of his life.